Hello, Urban Roots listeners. Deqah and Vanessa here.
Hello. So I know that we're between seasons at the moment, but Deqah and I are experimenting a little bit. We're kind of trying to create new content that we can air for you all between seasons, since each season takes a lot of time, a lot of love, a lot of effort, and we want to see if we can't give you some more bite-sized information. And so today, in that spirit, we are going to play an interview for you that we all did with Vishaan Chakrabarti, who is the co-founder and creative director of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism. I've known about Vishaan for a while, actually. I actually interviewed him like many years ago back in my architecture journalism days when he did a reimagining of Penn Station. And I've followed his career since then. And I've just always really admired both the work that he does and also the way he talks about the work and how accessible it is to kind of regular people. And he's been recently talking a lot about the need for us as a society to create more things like housing and more kind of equitable communities in our approach to architecture, design, and planning. And we just felt like he would be really aligned with the kinds of things that we're doing here at Urban Roots. And I mentioned it to Deqah, and she was super down, right,
Yeah,
Deqah?
I was super down because I am an urban planner and a historic preservationist. And I feel like Vishaan totally hit on all the things that we are just thinking about and wanting to explore and create for Urban Roots. He really hit on some important themes and concepts that I really also resonate with. When you're talking about preserving communities and being an urbanist and somebody who's really rooted in wanting to understand how cities are shaped and doing planning work that is done in the same mindset as what preservation of people and cities really need, what the community wants, and like what actually matters to the people who live in the spaces that we're doing work in as planners and preservationists.
I like how you described him as rooted in it. Let's listen to our interview with Vishaan now, and then if folks are interested in hearing what me and Deqah thought about it, stay tuned to the end credits, and you'll hear more about us and Urban Roots and Urbanist Media. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Vishaan.
Sure. My pleasure. Nice to be here.
So I guess for our first question, I'd love to introduce our audience to you. Some folks in our audience are more urbanism experts. Some are a little bit more general interest coming into the field for the first time. So there's a little bit of a range. So some people will know you immediately and others may not. But I'd love to hear about your journey to becoming an urban planner, because I know from our previous conversation, you came to this country as a child without too much money in your parents' pockets, as you explained it. And so, did you even know urban planning was an option? How did it come to you as a possibility?
No, not at all. So I was born in Calcutta to a pretty large family on both sides, and my dad's side in particular, from a pretty rural village in northern Bengal. But, like my parents were both really from Calcutta, studied there. And Calcutta is an amazing city. Even though we moved here when I was 2, we went back there a great deal. And I always loved it, actually. My dad was a scientist. My mother was a musician and a librarian. And we traveled, but on shoestring budgets. My dad would get a speaking invite, and he'd slice and dice an honorarium, and off we went. And we saw a lot of cities, and we saw a lot of art, and we ate a lot of different kinds of food. But none of that told me that there was a thing called architecture or urban planning. Architecture I knew a bit more about, and I was always architecture curious as like a kid and a teenager. But I also always loved cities. And I loved the diversity of cities and, the palimpsest, just the layers of history and narrative. Being a good Indian boy, you only could be a doctor or an engineer, or, if you want to be really scandalous, you could be a lawyer. And I studied engineering. I was a terrible engineering student. And my first internship in Boston was as a transportation planner. And actually, that's when I started really understanding kind of the roots of the segregation that I saw in Boston. Like, Boston's a very racialized city. And as a teenage kid moving around the city, you'd notice that certain lines had people of certain shades of color and certain lines had other shades of color. And like, when I first did that internship, I started understanding that there's real history. Like, this isn't just market forces that play. There's real history to this. And I did get very interested in urban planning at that point. I ended up studying both engineering and art history because I was interested in the visual and narrative. Um, and then my first job out of college was as an urban planner. And then I got a graduate degree in urban planning, and then I got another graduate degree in architecture. So I'm really an overeducated, heavily indebted cross-dresser. I finally got out of debt about 15 years after grad school.
Right.
But so it's the love of design at one level as an architect, but the love of cities and their stories at another level.
So you mentioned that it took you 15 years to crawl out of your debt hole. I'm sure a lot of people listening can relate to that, especially if they also went into the urban planning field. So that kind of takes us to our question about how you worked up the gumption to start your own practice. What do you think were the things that had prepared you to become an entrepreneur in this field and try and start a practice?
Well, first of all, a lot of racial blockades in establishment. I mean, we were talking a little bit earlier about this. I mean, one of the things that I really value about entrepreneurialism in this country, and I've spoken to a lot of people of color in this country about this, that entrepreneurialism is sometimes our best workaround for doing what we want to do, because there are so many barriers and impediments in existing systems. I mean, I was an architect in a major firm in 2005 and was basically told I was never going to become a partner because I wasn't white. And I was told that like in a really, really straightforward, unapologetic way. And so you just realize after a while that if you don't create your own thing, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to do what you want to do. And so I really do believe in that sense of entrepreneurialism. And as I said, I've had that shared conversation with a lot of people. But I think it's important to point out that it's not just because this is what drives me crazy a bit about the diversity conversation. It's not just about whether people who look different can do the same thing as white people have historically done. It's that when people of different backgrounds go and do those things, they do them differently and the outcome is different. And you start to change not just the narrative of your own story, but the narrative of the profession. And in fact, I don't really call myself an urban planner. I call myself an urbanist,
right,
just because an architect and an urbanist. And in part because I think planning has a really fraught history, urban renewal and all of that stuff. It has just even that word planning has sometimes a really tough top-down connotation. And it's not that I don't believe in the profession, I do, but I think the profession needs a tremendous amount of reform. And so like a lot of the work that I do through my own practice works at very different ways of advancing urbanism and advancing urbanism with communities as opposed to, on behalf of communities. Because I think that's a really critical distinction.
Oh, for sure. And actually, we definitely have some questions about that later, about how to work with communities. But I do want to give Deqah a chance to respond, because like some of the things that you were saying are like, oh, this is Deqah's language. Like you're in an industry, you need to make your own way, craft, and even the idea of not being an urban planner but an urbanist. I just wanted to hear Deqah's thoughts and let her kind of respond.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I'm going to hit on any of the specific questions we have here, because you've literally answered like like a bunch of them just by what you've been saying, which is
That's
great.
nice to hear, Deqah.
Yeah, no, you're like right on point.
I feel you're a pretty tough questioner.
I think we're like of the same people. Like we're really of like the same like mindset. I think so my background is I'm an undergrad in urban planning and a master's in historic preservation, and throughout all of that, I've just like felt that both of those fields are very white. I am a Somali American, first generation. My parents are immigrants. And they really stuck with me the value of education. So I kind of came to a crossroads in my life recently where it's like, do I want to continue on the path of education and going for a PhD, or do I want to really try to start to make more actionable change? And that's kind of why I started Urbanist Media. And again, with your mindset of Urbanist, and I'm like, yes, it's exactly where I was. I've had the name in my head for a long time, and it's really the Urbanist part is core, and the media part kind of came with the fact that we started this Urban Roots podcast, and I think that it can really make equitable change. And it has in Cincinnati, honestly, to an extent. I am like impressed by what we've been able to see from what we've done. And so more specifically, like the work that we do with our podcast, in particular the first season, which is a series we call Lost Voices of Cincinnati. Not to say that the voices in Cincinnati have been lost that we're telling, but they have been muted. And so we've told stories of African Americans in focusing on 3 Cincinnati neighborhoods, but we have a prelude episode that talks about the overall kind of history of Cincinnati's Black communities. And just with that, what we did was we wanted to speak directly with the community and the community members, in part because the oral histories were lacking. We just couldn't really find them. And I'm a historian. Like I know how to look for these things, right? So couldn't find them in the mainstream. So I went directly to the source and to the people. And what we've learned is that the people in the community, when we talk to them, they tell us a different story than we'd expect to hear. And that's what we try to capture and then retell. And we do it in a way that we like literally are like, hey, guests, we want to share either these, the clips that they have spoken in and the parts that they've spoken in. But ideally also we like to share the entire episode to make sure that we've put the context in correctly, right? And we're just retelling, helping them tell their story. We're not, where their voices are very prominently featured. And that really made me feel like we were able to connect with the community in a way that I don't think other people do. And like that's within the city. I mean, for sure, the city doesn't really ever consider that in Cincinnati. Like they talk a lot about caring about the people, but they don't actually seem to value and take advice or suggestions and do what the community actually wants. But also in historic preservation, and that's probably become more of my bread and butter now. And the preservation community has started to really see the importance of it. And I do that work here in Cincinnati on a regular. But so all of that is like incredibly important to me. And I love that, you're a seasoned professional. You've been doing this for a long time. And this conversation was always really exciting because I knew like I will be able to get even more of an understanding from somebody who's really has been doing this. So, and for a long time, and you've been able to see I change. And I think that's really cool. So the question that this leads to is, what do you see the role of a planner today as? And kind of weaving in the questions of, in academia and architecture, we tend to feel that this is a siloed, planning is kind of siloed in the fact that it's not as interwoven with those other practices. So we were kind of hoping you could speak to also like how these different disciplines interact within your practice today.
Sure. I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that background story. It's really great and very helpful. And one of the things that I found that the pandemic brought was a lot more Zoom interaction with communities, which I actually found to be a refreshing change of pace because, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this, there's a lot of data that's told us that a lot of the people who show up at community board meetings tend to be whiter, wealthier, they tend to be older because those are the people who have the time to come to community board meetings. And, the pandemic and Zoom broke open that dam. And suddenly we're finding much more representation at these meetings, and people that we haven't seen before, and people who maybe lead very, very busy lives, have a couple of jobs, are single parents, whatever it is, they're taking care of an elderly relative, but they can still zoom in and participate. I'm also finding like the Zoom polling functions and stuff allow for people who are maybe more introverted. And, because one of the things I've discovered working in a lot of communities of color is that, like, not everyone is so ready to just tell their story.
Right.
There is an intimidation factor where people, often don't feel like their story or their point of view is as valuable as others. And so I think having these different means to get at what people want and need and want to talk about is really important. And I think it's good to see technology for once do something that like people need. So that's an exciting part of our practice, because a lot of our work, and we did this very, very purposefully from the outset. We're just on the verge of celebrating our 7th year as a practice. And one of the things I'm really proud of is we're working in the places that we wanted to work. So we sort of said from the outset, no dictators, no, we're not going to, do this thing that a lot of people do, which is a lot of architects now find working in places like communities in the United States to be too complicated.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? Because, they call it things like bureaucracy, but what it really is people saying, you're building in my community. We want some say. Right. We want some agency. And so there was for a while, and it's still going on. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the crazy stuff on social media about like this new city being built in Saudi Arabia that's this linear city.
Yes.
I've talked to people who get involved in that stuff because they're like, well, I can go over there and I can experiment. And I'm like, what kind of colonialist bullshit is that? Whose land are you experimenting on? Right? Anyway, so 7 years ago, so we really set out to say, there are a lot of communities in distress and in need in this country. I mean, if you look at just like this water situation in Jackson, right? Like it's amazing to me in the wealthiest country in the world that you still find these absolutely insanely third world conditions. And I get to use that term because I was born in the third world. So like it's amazing to me. I mean, in Oakland, I see shanty towns that remind me of Calcutta. And in community after community, we're working in Detroit, in Indianapolis, in downtown Niagara Falls. And the stories are different, but there are always these parallels of who was left behind when things happen. Not just the stories we know about highway construction and all of that. I mean, I think that's pretty well known, but also just like the impacts of redlining. To me, some of the most heartbreaking stories are the stories about communities where white flight happens, all this disinvestment happens, all this kind of social distress happens, but a community hangs together and keeps this place a vibrant, functioning place. They actually do it on their own with almost no help. And then 20 years later, after that hard work is done, some bunch of kids discovers this and thinks it's cool. And then the next thing you know, gentrification starts happening in that community that people fought for 20 years to kind of hold together. And I see that in place after place. Walter Hood, who's a landscape architect, MacArthur genius, African-American friend of mine, teaches at Berkeley. He coined this term placekeeping as opposed to placemaking, which is instead of thinking about how you graft a new place onto an existing place, is how do you amplify what is great about an existing place, including, keeping residents. And where I think this all gets much more challenging, and especially as an architect, like we're doing a lot of social housing projects. Like, so in East New York, one of the poorest parts of New York City, we just got a 22-1 vote in favor from the community board to advance our project, which is about 2,000 units of pretty deeply affordable housing. And I'm really proud of that vote. It took 5 years of interaction with the community to get us to this point. And so I guess that's the bureaucracy that other people complain about. But I'm really proud that we have this foundation where we're working with people to understand what income levels are needed for this housing, what scale are they interested in, the whole thing of micro enterprise, vocational training, local business and local enterprise, union training on construction trades, this whole gamut of issues that people are interested in beyond just the building. And a lot of that, to me, is about continuing the narrative of the place, of saying, we built up this place is valuable to us. We do have needs, things like housing and open space, but the introduction of those things can't not just displace people, but displace the things that made this place. And that's hard work, and it takes a tremendous amount of patience. And
Yeah.
but it's also, I just want to close out by saying something that Deqah said about actionable work. And I really believe in actionable work. We're in a housing crisis across this country. We're in an infrastructure crisis across this country. And we have to figure out how to build, but build in a way that is about this palimpsest instead of that old sense of just displacing what was there with something new.
So there's like a million threads that we could pull from that statement. Like I can respond to a lot of different elements around storytelling, continuing the narrative, community engagement. But I think for me, I would like to ask you what I think is kind of the central question that we wanted to really talk to you about, because I think it just relates to a lot of what you've said and what we're really interested in, which is this question of finding the balance when you're talking to communities between preservation and building new, right? Because obviously Deqah and I believe in the value of preserving buildings. And when we talk to people in the communities, they tell us, if you get rid of all the buildings that I once knew, the buildings that had some significance to my history or my ancestors' history, you're cutting off that narrative. There is no sense of continuity of what was before to what is now today. On the other hand, I'm telling you now that people here are hurting. They need housing, right? They need more reliable means of transportation, more walkable means of transportation. We need more green space. We have pollution in our community. Like, there's a million things that need to be done that require building new, and people recognize that, but they also want to preserve something of the past. So my question for you is, how do you walk that line or thread that needle when you're talking to communities and both things are true?
What Vanessa is saying really is almost this term that I've really tried to start to bring into the mainstream called community preservation. Hopefully that resonates with you a little bit.
Yeah. And in fact, so look, I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers here. This is a very difficult line that you're talking about. And sometimes I think we get it right, and sometimes I think we get it wrong. I don't want to be in any way Pollyannish about that. It's a very difficult thing. I think it's important to draw the distinction between community preservation and building preservation. Sometimes those things overlap, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes community preservation is actually about, okay, let's really together with a community look at the physical fabric that's truly, truly important. And then beyond that, say, beyond those things that are maybe really, truly important, the community preservation actually entails the building of new things, right? Like, we do have a housing crisis and there's housing demand. And I've also heard from communities in a lot of places that, one of our central goals is we want a place for our kids and our grandchildren. We want that thread of continuity, which means more housing, which means that it's not about sprawl, which often means that it's more density. It does mean some amount of surgical demolition of something that's old and, replacing it with housing. Sometimes you look at our public housing stock, a lot of our public housing stock is reaching building obsolescence. I mean, the absolute scandal of what happened to our public housing during Superstorm Sandy in New York City where you had grandmothers living 20 floors in the air without a working elevator and no storm resilience whatsoever. So it is this project by project, place by place, community by community, archaeological expedition in my mind, right? To understand, okay, there's maybe a certain amount of physical fabric that's really important to preserve, but that the preservation of the community is going to require way more than the preservation of that fabric. And we've seen this, and Deqah really, I'm sure, knows this as someone who studied historic preservation. There's so many examples of places where we've preserved building stock only to see that building stock converted into something that completely displaces the previous community, into something that gets gentrified and remade as something that, sure, it's historic fabric, but it hasn't preserved the community at all. And I guess to me, the short answer to your question is there's no one line. It is a project by project, community by community study and investigation into what are the things that matter from a physical perspective, and then from a social perspective, what are the larger things that matter in terms of community preservation.
I so really value what you say here about this community by community study investigation to learn what matters from the physical to the social. And I tend to think that the social is just not done as often.
One thing that I'm seeing is I do think communities of color are gaining voice in this society. And I think as they gain voice, these conversations about community participation and preservation are changing, and they're changing drastically. And the reason, in my mind, that they're changing is historically, under a sort of 1960s liberal Jane Jacobs framework, where it was white communities that wanted participation and preservation. Those are communities that typically had equity in their communities, right? So you owned a townhouse in the West Village. Maybe you bought that townhouse for very little money, but still, you bought it at a time when your family or whatever, you had the wherewithal to gain equity in the society in a way that a lot of communities of color didn't. And so what I think is happening over time is that community participation and preservation, as it's been understood by sort of older white liberal communities, is about no change.
Right.
Right? Because no change means that they get to keep what they consider to be theirs. And there's all sorts of code words around this. Neighborhood character, the amount of liberal communities in, progressive bastions like New York City or San Francisco, where you can't build a homeless shelter and you can't build affordable housing because there are white communities that say, nope, this is about preservation. And if you care about community participation, then you're going to not let change happen in my community. I find that when you then bring communities of color into the picture, the conversation changes drastically, because a lot of those people do not have equity. They're renters. They recognize that rents go up. They recognize that their children don't have access to housing. And I find them to be much less change averse than that kind of Jane Jacobs model that we learned about from the 1960s and 1970s, which doesn't mean that they invite change in some wholesale way. But I find that there's a much more intelligent, much more critical conversation about what kind of change could and should happen. And I think that's a huge distinction in this conversation.
I think that you and Deqah are really pointing to a seismic shift, I guess, happening in the industry. And it sounds like, Deqah, you're on the forefront with a small little vanguard of people putting on this movement away from preservation towards community preservation. And I wonder if it would be helpful to maybe dig a little deeper into the history of the preservation movement. You've already kind of brought it up a little bit with mentioning Jane Jacobs, but when it was founded, what was preservation attempting to protect and preserve, and what was it neglecting? And as we're moving forward and kind of changing the concept of what preservation might mean, how do we think that might be able to change? How can we preserve in a different way?
The landmarks movement starts in this country with the demolition of Penn Station in 1963. And it is a very, very wealthy white movement in the beginning, which doesn't mean that it's all bad. I mean, Jackie O's involved. They saved Grand Central Station. The nation's landmarks laws are written. Over time, this evolves from historically significant structures to historic districts. And I think for the most part, a lot of what that movement did was quite good. So I think there's two real problems with it. One, it was almost entirely about buildings and physical fabric and very little about community narrative or people's narrative. Two is like, when does it become a cudgel to basically, keep wealthy neighborhoods wealthy? And as I said, to start, to enter into this framework that we're now in with this code words around neighborhood character.
Right. To create like a time capsule that's frozen and can't evolve and adapt.
Yeah. Which also, as urbanists, we should remember that cities are fundamentally about change, and change is a really important part of progress. And so, you can't, and I mean social progress. So, you can't just freeze things in time and expect social progress to occur. So if we shift to a lens of community preservation as opposed to the preservation of just historic building stock, then I think it's a much broader discussion about what does it mean in a world where cities are gentrifying really rapidly, especially like what we historically call our first tier cities, although I kind of hate that term.
Right.
So Walter and I have discussed this a lot. Part of our challenge as designers, as architects and landscape architects, is we live in a world now where anytime we try to do something good, like design a better park or design a better piece of infrastructure, in our real estate market, there is immediately this consequence of like land values going up and people getting displaced and so forth. So now you have this crazy thing where communities that have been completely denied access to good infrastructure are often wary of good infrastructure being built in their community because they're afraid it's going to lead to displacement. And I get why, right? But like, there's something really wrong in our society if we say we're going to build a new park in this neighborhood that hasn't had the green space, and people are worried, well, that park is not going to be for them and that park is going to displace people and so forth. That, I think, is because we don't have this conversation around community preservation that should come part and parcel with that proposal for a park, right? And so I think we're seeing this much more now. Like, so if new affordable housing measures are being built, but at the same time, tenant anti-harassment protections and other kinds of protections that make sure that existing communities aren't displaced. To me, that sense of preservation is a much more interesting, much broader one than saying, well, Edgar Allan Poe slept here once. Let's not tear down this building. Like that, like I think those are tricky things because it can, again, be a way to stop a homeless shelter from being built. And so, it's a very nuanced conversation.
Yeah, I agree with that. I really think that when people are planning and making decisions that remove a basketball court from an urban park when they redesign it, and they take away the things that, they might think, oh, having this here might mean that it's going to be less, more Black people, less safe. Even if they don't say it that way, by removing things that have historically been bringing the Black people to that specific neighborhood and community, the planners and the people that make these decisions and do it in a way with a segregated mindset are just perpetuating that segregated mindset. I guess my mind is thinking about Over the Rhine in Cincinnati. It has the largest amount of intact Italianate architecture in the country, and like this concentration, and the entire area is a historic district. So it means that people are able to apply for historic tax credits, and it's mostly developers and those types of people who are coming in because this neighborhood had a lot of disinvestment over the years. So in the 90s and 2000s, it was pretty disheveled, and then and vacant buildings. It wasn't seen as a safe place, and so those parks that had the basketball courts have been redesigned, and now they have dog parks. And it's like that is so obvious to me that you're removing and trying to avoid lower income people and African American people from using these places because you feel that they are unsafe if they have these populations utilize it. And in the same light, the specific park I'm thinking about was across the street from a homeless shelter. And through the changes in the neighborhood, the homeless shelter was forced to move. And like that is so heartbreaking to me. And so I find that that's like one obvious issue with like the way that planning can be done. And I think that needs to be rectified. But I think not just because of those actions and seeing what it looks like now, but the history, right? The history behind it, knowing that African Americans have been displaced before, right? They were displaced from the West End, having to move to the Over the Rhine neighborhood. And now you're making them move out of Over the Rhine. So I do think that maybe I'm a big proponent of like America needs to rectify this by all whatever necessary, honestly. Like if it is literally physically giving money to people, then it needs to happen. But obviously as a planner, I do think that or as an urbanist, I would say, I think that there is a lot more to rectifying something as well than necessarily throwing money. But I obviously think that African Americans have been so screwed over that those conversations need to happen. And in historic preservation, the National Register of Historic Places, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, was created at a time when we were in segregation. And to me, it just like doesn't do preservation justice for the government to not think about how to maybe restructure some laws or rethink things to, be more beneficial to maybe that narrative storytelling of the people of color. Mm-hmm. And like there are tangible examples of this in preservation. Like if you have a Black historic district that has a lot of vacant parcels, then you might not be able to designate it because it's not seen as historically significant because it needs to have integrity to be historically significant, which is like kind of doesn't make any sense at all. Like significant should be tied to the history and the context.
Right.
So it's all those things that I think that, all come together. And at the end of the day, like things need to change.
Yeah, it's like to say that Detroit isn't historic because it's pockmarked with vacant land is just crazy, right? It's just absolutely crazy. And that's, to me, the problem with the focus on the buildings. I mean, sure, there are certain buildings that are always going to be important, but that's kind of, to me, at this point, less the issue. And it's interesting that example you raise about the vacant land because, in so many of the cities in which I work, there's so much vacant land, right? So cars, urban renewal, like so much vacant land. And to me, the sort of, the Reparations Act goes way, like to me, money is one thing, but to me, the most important thing is housing, because housing is what stabilizes communities, right? The right kind of housing. I mean, like if people know they can stay there, know they can raise their family there, know that their children can stay there, that creates community continuity in a way that no amount of like saving historic fabric can do. And that is the crisis of our cities today, right? The crisis of our cities today is kind of like one story or the other. It's the story of the New Yorks and Bostons and San Franciscos that have lost huge amounts of their sort of native historic populations that were once segregated, but now have been displaced even from those segregated communities, as you're saying. Or they're really down and out cities where they've seen a lot of deindustrialization, lack of economic access, a lot of disinvestment, where there's the potential to sort of rebuild and create some sense of community continuity again. And the problem is we never learn. Like, I see how like California gets expensive, and then all of a sudden there's all these people moving to places like Austin, Texas, and then Austin, Texas, which didn't historically have an affordable housing problem, all of a sudden has an affordable housing problem. And that's the thing that we could have so much more focus on and regulatory strength around in terms of this notion of community preservation. And the last thing I just say about that is we constantly fail to see as how that would be good for everybody, right? Like the fact that what made those cities interesting in the first place wasn't because they were filled with a bunch of luxury condos and chain stores. It's because they were filled with culture. That's what attracted us to them in the first place. And so that act of community preservation isn't just good for the community. It's good for our whole sense of why we like these places in the first place. It's amazing to me how much we can keep missing this.
It's fundamental.
It's really fundamental.
It's why we like cities, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm not to toot my own horn here, but I will say that if you haven't listened to season 4 of City of the Future, I recommend it. That's my former podcast, because season 4 was all about more equitable means of development that can generate wealth for residents, renters, or owners, and kind of alternative models of wealth generation that I'm hoping will be much more central to the conversation in development, because I think what you were saying, it's housing, it's about being able to stay. It's also about hopefully your children being able to stay, right? And so I do think that these conversations kind of have to intermingle, and they're very like interdisciplinary, right? But they're all part of the same attempting to make more equitable what has been inequitable.
Mm-hmm.
I know we don't have very much time. Shall we talk a little bit about Indianapolis and the work you're doing there?
Sure. I mean, I'm going there in October. We're breaking ground on a bridge that we've been designing.
Yeah, and just so you know, Vishaan, in our season we just wrapped for Urban Roots, we did a 2-part episode on the history of Indiana Avenue in Indianapolis, which was the thriving Black thoroughfare for much of Indianapolis's history. Madam Walker set up her headquarters there. There were theaters, there were restaurants, there were cafes, and we kind of tell the story of the mid-20th century, how it kind of fell into decline. And part 2 is all about people in Indianapolis now who are doing the hard work on the ground of potentially trying to bring back more activity along that corridor, and also just kind of resurface the history of the place. And a lot of their emphasis was on connection. Like, we've been so disconnected. And so that's why I thought it was quite interesting that you're literally working on a bridge in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
So I wanted to hear about it more.
And this is in Northwest Indianapolis, where there is a lot of physical disconnection. There's a hospital district that employs a lot of people, a pretty diverse population that it employs. There is housing to the north, a historically community of color. There's this kind of burgeoning research innovation district in between those two. And to me, a few things that were really healthy about that process. Again, actually all of it was designed during the pandemic. So all of the community interaction happened over on Zoom. And again, it was actually one of the first projects where I started noticing that, like, wow, this is really different. We're hearing from a lot of different voices. And those voices helped us. First of all, it's the most pedestrian-oriented bridge or roadway project that's ever been built there. So it's about, there's only one lane of traffic on each side. And, the remainder is pedestrian, bike, and also public space. And this was an interesting aspect. The public space, what was really requested was not a kind of channeling, because there's multiple communities, not a channeling or privileging of one narrative over the other, but a public space that could host a lot of different ways of sort of storytelling. And I mean, it's not huge, but it's enough that, like, different kinds of gatherings can happen. during the weekends, there isn't a lot of traffic. And so you could imagine the entire bridge getting closed to a community event. So we really saw the bridge as something that was not just kind of this traditional piece of infrastructure, but a public platform. And then the other piece of it that we thought was super important was the bridge spans Fall Creek. And when I first went there, and I got my first vaccination, and like the 2 weeks passed, and then I got on a plane and I went to see the site because I was dying to see the site. And I can't think of another city I've been to anywhere in the world that has this sense of like verdant, untouched nature in the middle of the city. And so you crossed into the embankment of Fall Creek, and suddenly you're surrounded by these trees. They're bald eagles. And so even though you're in the heart of this like major American city, you are surrounded by greenery. And so the place is really an oasis. So the notion that you could create a gathering spot that, belonged to multiple communities who could host events in the middle of this kind of urban oasis, to us was just really beautiful and really poetic. And again, like on that same trip, I went to some of these neighborhoods where, again, like, you hear these stories of things that were done in these communities in the 50s and 60s, and you're just like, oh my God, why aren't these people in the streets protesting every day given what happened? And yet, of course, we're seeing those forces of gentrification and so forth. So, I do hope that the bridge just acts as this small piece of public connection that helps the communities around it kind of re-engage with their own history and re-engage with this place and re-engage with the ecology of the place. But, it just, every time I go to one of these cities, I realize how much work we have to do. That like, yeah, there's some acupuncture we can do as a firm, but there's so much that needs to happen at the national political level that there's not a lot we can impact as a firm. It just reveals that.
I wonder, maybe as like a final closing question, just if there's one word of advice that you would give to the kind of urbanist community about how we can move towards community preservation, what would you tell people to try and do in their everyday life and practice?
In my book from now 10 years ago, I talked about this notion of an infrastructure of opportunity, that we need to build an infrastructure of opportunity in this country, which isn't just traditional infrastructure, but all the things that create social mobility and preserve a sense of community. And so that includes everything from affordable housing to schools to parks to a bunch of non-physical things that have to do with people's livelihoods and well-being. And like, I still really believe that. And so it's interesting, 10 years later, we are seeing infrastructure bills and other things finally moving through Congress that have this broader definition of what social infrastructure is and can be. So I think fighting for that social infrastructure, and what that does then force us to do is have this nuanced view of preservation that we've been talking about, of saying we're trying to preserve a community. That doesn't mean preserving every building. It means what is the larger context in which we can keep these cultures alive and thriving in our cities and our communities.
Thank you. Deqah, did you have any last questions or thoughts?
I just think that you're doing all the great work, and I'm super excited to see what else comes from, I've been really empowered by speaking with you. So I have like a million other questions, but instead of asking all of them, I'll just, wait till we have a follow-up interview with you about all these other amazing things that you've been doing. But yeah, I mean, I think, there's a lot of things that need to change in preservation and planning in the fields. And what I find most empowering is that we have a similar mindset, right? That the way I'm thinking could actually lead to like success in the future. So that's what I find empowering from, at least at this moment.
Well, I really appreciate that. I'm not doing all the good work. I mean, what's hard is you can't have too hard an ideological litmus test about what you do out there, because then it becomes paralyzing, right? You have to allow yourself to make mistakes. And you're not going to get it right all the time. So I know we're not doing all the good work, but like I'm really glad, Deqah, that you're focused on this question of the actionable, because to me, there's a lot of action to take out there.
There's a lot of great things that come to with collaboration. And I actually feel like I wonder if like we, have interacted with the same people with the work that you've done in Indianapolis and what we've done in Indianapolis, because like Uli and Claudia Polly, and I mean also just let us know what you think of our stuff. I'm always happy to hear feedback. I'm like a big feedback person, but also like no one's ever given us like terrible feedback, so I'm okay with it.
All right, will do.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Okay, so like Deqah said, we are looking for feedback. We hope that you enjoyed that interview, and we'd love to know what you thought. If you think we should interview more people or experiment with different types of content, we are open. And I hope you liked it, because we really enjoyed this conversation. Deqah, I know you really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I absolutely enjoyed it. Vishaan was dope.
And I still think, and I know we said this in the intro, but I still think this like shift towards community preservation is so important to underscore. It's just a totally different way of thinking about what preservation is. It's like, it's not just about saving the historic artifacts. It's about how can the community continue to be present and thrive in this place. Like when he was talking about that difference between placemaking and placekeeping, which I think he mentioned was coined by his friend Walter Hood, like that is so central to preservation. And I don't know, I'm curious to get your thoughts. Like, do you think preservationists are starting to think in this way? Like, where do you see this change starting to happen in the industry?
To be honest, in preservation, I think that it's really happening because there has been a very obvious gap in the stories of people of color and women that are being preserved or lack thereof. For example, 2% of places listed in the National Register of Historic Places are dedicated to the stories of Black people, African Americans, and 10% or less is dedicated towards women and people of color as a whole. So that includes Latinx and Indigenous stories and Black American stories and other types of ethnicities.
Asian Americans,
LGBTQ plus, all of it. It is
only 10%.
Only 10%. So it's really just like so many practitioners are, and maybe even like grantors, right, are really thinking about how to provide funding to groups that are wanting to uplift the voices of people of color and women.
Yeah. I think it also speaks to maybe like the fact that the methods have been kind of limited. You said the National Register of Historic Places, they do things like landmarking, right? Like they're the ones who put like the plaque out or make sure you can't demolish a place, right?
Yeah, to an extent. Sometimes the historical marker program is like state run, but I mean, a lot of this is like kind of funded through preservation funding that just in general comes from that National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 that I referenced in the episode.
Right. And it's like that really matters. Don't get us wrong, right? Like we are all for keeping historic places, especially places that were of historic significance to people of color and women. But like I think what Vishaan makes us think about is like, how could preservation be bigger than that? Right? Like, how can it be about, like, he gives the example, I think, of like, yeah, okay, maybe you keep a historic building, but the insides of it get completely gutted and it's now becomes, I don't know, like a space for a completely different subset of the community that wasn't there before. And so you've kept the facade of historic preservation, but you've kind of undone the integrity of it, if you will. And I feel like that's what's most interesting to me. It's like, how do you help preserve the story and the spirit of the community and their like economic well-being and their ability to stay in that community through not just the building, but everything around it, right? And I think that kind of more holistic view of preservation is what's so interesting and different about what Vishaan's doing, and also kind of like how you think about preservation, Deqah, and like why you started your not-for-profit and the podcast.
Right, Urbanist Media, the anti-racist community preservation nonprofit, and Vishaan referenced the term community preservation. I was so excited, and he calls himself an urbanist, and I'm just like,
not a planner, right?
Not a planner, right? Yeah, and it's incredible to see how like those terms evolve, because our roles evolve as practitioners, and as a historian, like I recognize like Vishaan isn't necessarily like an urban historian or a preservationist per se. Like he has his degrees in urban planning, and I love the fact that preservation can be something that it's not necessarily like um you could call yourself a preservationist, different levels of being a preservationist. And some of it, is that you've got that quote unquote master's degree in historic preservation or equivalent. But really, like, Vanessa, you are a preservationist. Like, I am so impressed with like just everything that you have, brought to Urban Roots. But like, you're not just a journalist anymore, right? You're a preservationist. You're an urbanist. I mean, we've known you're an urbanist. That's hands down, like being rooted in wanting to like understand more about the people and not just be about buildings or development. I think that's what a true urbanist really is. Kind of somebody who thinks about things in the social equity aspects.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's funny. I'd never really thought about that before. Like, because I guess you're right. Like through the work that we're doing, I've become a kind of preservationist, maybe not the typical one, but kind of one. And I, as you said, like I've always, or for my career anyway, for the past decade or so, I've considered myself an urbanist, which to me has meant, being pro public transportation, pro affordable housing, pro more equitable infrastructure, more equitable methods of kind of wealth generation for people in cities. And I never really thought of that as being part of preservation. Like preservation felt like a different discussion. And I still felt like it was important. I was like, oh yeah, we definitely want historic character and historic buildings, but I never saw them as aligned. And I think that's what's been so interesting about getting involved in this podcast and working with you, is that actually they are aligned. You can't have one without the other. And another thing that Vishaan mentioned that I think we should touch on briefly is just this idea of giving communities their story back, and how powerful and transformative that is. And like that theme comes up a lot in season 2 and season 1 of our podcasts. Like giving people their story back is so central to what we're trying to do. And it's why we talk to community members and make sure their voices are in the podcast. And that too is an act of preservation. Like whether it's tied to physical preservation or not, like keeping that story is so central to a community moving forward, right? And so that does intersect with urbanism and what's new. It's like, how do we thread what was and what will be? It's by having a story and a through line.
Right. Exactly. So traditional preservation tends to be seen as like, let's save this old building. Yeah. And I think this idea of community preservation starts to bring to light, like, hey, let's save the people's stories. Let's save what's important to their history.
Their ability to stay in that place and keep telling that story.
Exactly. Because we've been talking in our episodes about how people have been displaced and how their communities have been dismantled and how everything is just not what it used to be. And half the time, like, we talk about preserving and saving buildings and places, but if these communities of color have had their spaces demolished over time and they don't exist anymore, well, isn't it still important to want to save them and preserve them, even if they're not tangible?
Totally.
And we do the intangible with the podcast here too.
Yeah. So, I mean, if people are liking what we're talking about and want to get involved, Deqah, what should they do? How can they help Urban Roots or Urbanist Media? Where should they go?
I would say first and foremost, like, if you want to see more podcasts, if you want to see more from, me and Vanessa, from the Urbanist Media Collective, please donate. Go on Patreon, follow us at Urban Roots Pod, donate on PayPal or Venmo at Urbanist Media. Also, just follow us. Just share our podcast. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Urban Roots Culture, and on Twitter, Urban Roots Pod. And don't forget that amazing little Patreon that I just said there, Urban Roots Pod.
Also, I would love to hear from people, even if it's just to be like, love what you're doing, or talk about this, or whatever, or maybe
let's hear from
don't
people.
Talk about that, but we'll take that into consideration, I suppose. But I would just love to hear people's voices. So our email is urbanrootspodcast@gmail.com. You can send us an email, you can send us a voice memo. Who knows, maybe as we're experimenting with content, maybe we'll do a mailbag episode and you'll get to hear your voice. But we really want this, in keeping with what we're trying to do with this podcast. We want to represent people's voices and communities, and that includes the Urban Roots listening community. And we want to know what you want to know more about. So we'd love to hear from you and know what we can make and what stories we should talk about that you care about.
Absolutely. Yeah. You guys, please reach out to us. Our email, again, urbanrootspodcast@gmail.com. So thank you so much for listening and staying tuned with us always.
Thank you also to Vishaan for doing this interview, and to the great Connor Lynch who edited this episode.
Yes, thank you, Connor.
Okay, I think that's it. You want to hit the good people with our tagline, Deqah?
Yeah, absolutely. Urban Roots, looking back so we can move forward.